from to study and learn. Recently, I've been pondering, what I'm doing in this channel, what my purpose is, and whether I should continue, and just for what reasons am I even endeavoring in an area that I have no business endeavoring. I have no skill sets for this. But I know that for the last, it's been 5 years plus, maybe 5 to 6 years, I have been intensely studying scriptures, focusing more so on the old writings, which we would understand as the Old Testament, much more than I ever was, and incorporating what we would call apocryphal writings, but they're not apocryphal writings. They were just hidden from us. They were stolen from us and taken from us, but they're so germane to understanding the faith that we live in. So I've been intensely studying that, and then I've been wanting to share the things that I've learned, because it takes a lot of time to do that, and not everybody has, not everybody can. It's just hard to do. But if you don't study the old writings, you cannot know what the new writings are based upon. And so I've been trying to find ways to do the work for people, share what I'm learning, and try to, as much as I can, bullet point and nutshell and consolidate and bring the themes out that I'm seeing and I'm reading, and just sharing them, differentiating between what is expressly taught, what is expressly observed, and what is inferred, what is spoken that doesn't have clear meaning either in history or we just can't know, and so we speculate on it. And unfortunately, let me rephrase that. Because I have been doing this, I have discovered that I can now protect myself. I can protect myself in ways I could not protect myself 6-7 years ago. Because while I had a working knowledge of church doctrines, I did not have a true working knowledge of the old writings. I had some familiarity. I'd read it many times in differing times. But I had never really tried to understand it like I have been for the last 5 or 6 years. And now I'm realizing that by understanding the old writings, you can protect yourself from the imaginations of men, from the imagination and the infiltration of the enemy into the church, and the messaging that is being brought to the church through the institutions and the doctrines of church. I'm discovering that you can protect yourself from it, and my interest is to help other people learn and see. Well, I would say that, I've been on this effort for a little while, not believing that I have. I'm not claiming that I have all the doctrines in line, but I can really see where the doctrines that I have been taught throughout my life are challengeable at best, and just flat wrong, and intentionally wrong at worst. It's the work of the enemy through the church, to the church, just like we had prophesied, just as it was spoken of in the letters. We had, in the new writings, we're told that many are going to come in, and they did early on. And now we have an entire portfolio of church doctrines that are based upon other things than the scriptures. And that's what I'm trying to differentiate. Knowing that I come from that background, I have to I am on a quest to attach myself to those doctrines that have been ingrained in me, and learn what the scriptures really say, so that I can build correct doctrines, or more correct doctrines. And really what I find is that there's very little we can know expressly. The scriptures expressly teach certain things. There are things, and when I get into the old writings, there are certain things that are unmistakable, and that I will state emphatically because it's expressly taught. But the majority of things in the old writings are references to things we can't know in history, things that were going on in the time, things that are going to happen in the future that we can only speculate on, and that's all we're doing. So we spend an awful lot of our time inferring and speculating off of inferences, and I don't really want to do that. I want to be able to distinguish when somebody is offering me an idea, an imagination, a speculation about information that they've seen, and to know when they really don't have enough information to they can't have it, or they need to show me where it's at. Because now, hopefully I was clear in that thought, people come up with ideas, they come up with speculations, and I want to be able to distinguish fact from fiction. In other words, I can now call them out. And if I don't recognize it, and if I don't know it, I have the means and the tools in my belt to go and study it out and find if what they're saying is built off of express positions in Scripture, or if they're taking things that are broadly referenced, that are clearly in Scripture but are not being explained to us in Scriptures, and then inferring and running and creating, imagining doctrines and running with them. What I'm saying is I now can just protect myself from it, and I'm trying to share that with people, and I want to share that with. I want to share, not so much because I can't. I'm learning it's too much. Scriptures are huge. The task is too big. If somebody can't be enticed into doing their own study, they'll never really be able to protect themselves. They are just now turning to a different set of people to feed them information, and then they're dependent upon the people that are feeding them the information to be honest, fair, of his, to belong to Elohim and Yahushua. But once again, they're at the mercy of people and things. So I really want people to be able to protect themselves as well. And so I want to encourage people, but I'm just helping as I go. So one of the things that happened early on in my foray into this endeavor is that I would begin to speak with people and argue with respect to the letters of Paul, and try to argue within the construct of the letters of Paul and the Gospels. But the letters of Paul tend to be the most argued letters, because through the letters we really have this idea, the ideas of the church that we're just in a different new covenant. I guess not entirely just the letters, because we do have references in the gospel when Yahushua says, take this cup. It represents the new covenant, my blood, in my blood. And then the church runs with that. But what I'm saying is that I think I make a mistake when I try to argue the problems that I see from the new writings, because within the doctrines that the church has taught the church are explanations for almost everything. There's a paradigm. They have created a construct. They have created church doctrines, and those church doctrines are born out of these new writings, out of the New Testament. And so pretty much they have a construct. When I talk to somebody and they start trying to test what I'm saying against their understanding and against the New Testament, they keep finding affirmations for their doctrines because the explanations have been given to them. And so when they begin to read, they immediately begin to process through their understandings that the church has given them for interpreting the New Testament writings. Recently, in recent years, but certainly in recent months, I'm coming to the conclusion, I think, that you will not be able to explain to somebody who's not motivated to see it, who wasn't seeing it anyway. I'm one of those people that I saw the problems in the church doctrines anyway. I just didn't recognize that I was seeing them as problems, but they unsettled me, always unsettled me. I saw things throughout the new writings that I glossed and didn't even know I was glossing. The church has no explanation for them, and their explanations that they give, once again, they just fall short when you test it against the old writings. But I saw that. So I was already troubled when the concepts came along that were introduced to me that motivated me, that I am Israel, that I have joined Israel, and that Israel is the story, not the church, not this new covenant church that we have built out of the doctrines of the New Testament. That is not the essence. That is not the plan of Yahuwah. The plan of Yahuwah is Israel, and it's always been Israel. The church is Israel. It is the remnant of Israel. It is the believing remnant of the larger plan of Israel. And that is, that's evidence throughout Paul's writings. It's evidence throughout the gospel accounts. It's just evidence that the entirety of our scriptures, new and old writings, are all about Israel. This concept that the church has become the focus of Elohim, God, through Jesus, and because the Israel has rejected Messiah. Well, that's born out of church doctrine. Now, the church does remain the focus of Elohim and of the Messiah, Jesus, because the church is the believing remnant of Israel. So it does remain the focus. But the fact that Yahushua or Jesus is the light of the nations and that the messaging went out to the nations. First of all, the nations were always allowed to, the Gentiles, the Goyim, were always allowed to join Israel. If you wanted to belong to Israel, you could. You embraced their ways, you joined them, and you just joined yourself to one of the clans, and you became part of Israel as a Goyim, as someone not born into Israel. Outside of the promises, you could enter the promises. Well, that's what's taken place on wholesale basis since the time of Jesus, Yahushua. And that is that the Goyim, the nations, that what we've come to understand as Gentiles, have been able to join in mass to the messaging of Jesus. And they did, but they joined Israel. But unfortunately, once the false doctrines made their way in, the idea of the Gentile church took over, because the numbers of the Gentiles, the numbers of the Goyim grew, and so it took over. And this idea of the Gentile church, Catholicism, and all the things that grew out of all of these doctrines from Nicaea and from Constantine and Rome and even before Constantine, all these things grew and focused on this idea of a different grouping of people, a new grouping of people subject to a new covenant. Well, and not the covenant of Israel. Well, all of this is problematic and represent teachings that are church-based, and they do. And my point is, if you begin to test and challenge people who are committed to the church and the church teachings, because they're committed to church and they're committed to Him, they are taught to be firm in their doctrines and to not listen to others bringing outside things, not realizing that the outside things had already been brought to them. You want Elohim, you want God, you want Jesus, you want Yahushua. Elohim is just another, it's the appropriate Hebrewish word for God, and Yahushua is the Hebrewish name of our Messiah versus Jesus, which is the Greekish name of our Messiah. So if you hear me, I'm trying to differentiate between the two. But what I'm saying is you want Elohim, you want Yahushua, and so you think that you have arrived there through the church, and you have arrived there. But in the midst of the church is teaching doctrines that are actually causing us to not learn His ways. We have actually embraced, as the church, we've embraced doctrines of demons. We have embraced idol worship, because when we are worshiping Christmas and Saturnalia and Easter, the goddess Easter and Valentine's Day and the various things that we're doing, there are many things about what we've incorporated into our faith that are basically worshiping other mighty ones, worshiping other gods, and we just don't realize it. And nobody in the church wants to acknowledge that or believe that. It's hard to accept that. But when you begin to truly evaluate the messaging of the church, and you test it against the new writings, you will be able to justify your position over and over again if you stay in the new writings. Because the new writings are the basis for the paradigm that's been drawn up for you, the construct that's been drawn up for you. I'm going to call it imagination because it is what we have constructed in our mind, in our imaginations that the church has given us, and it is our construct for interpreting the New Testament. And if we stay in the New Testament without truly understanding the Old Testament, then it's not good. We will always come back to the same, I shouldn't say that, but you come back to the same conclusions. The way to test the messaging is to test it against the old writings. I would hope that everyone, with a honest assessment of what Yahushua is born into and John the Baptist is born into, and all of the disciples, all of the Talmidim, the taught ones, all of them are born into an Israel nation. All of them are born into Torah. All of them are born into what's left of Israel, which is the southern kingdom, Yehuda, and therefore they're all called Yehudim, those of Yehuda, which, is Judah in most translations and most churches, and Jews. The Yehudim are Jews. Judah is, Judah. Yehuda is Judah. I'm sorry. Okay. So everybody's born into it. And everybody's born into the covenant of Horeb, Mount Sinai, the covenant that was brought in the days of Moses. Everybody of that era was born into it. And Yahushua himself, Jesus himself, said that he was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. He was sent to Israel because I hope everybody can understand he is Israel's Messiah. He's Israel's Messiah. He has become the Messiah of the Goyim and those who will join, but only those who will join and join Israel because he is Israel's Messiah. I hope you can see that. And when we start going back into Isaiah and all of the various things that we do in church doctrines to see how it all pointed to the Messiah, and when we read about Paul arguing with the Bereans and them testing the scriptures to see if what they would be so, his effort was to show that Jesus, Yahushua, was the promised Messiah. Well, they were studying not new letters, not gospel accounts, and not letters, and not the revelation. They were studying the Tanakh, the Torah, the writings of Moses and the prophets, and this is where they proved out that Jesus was the Messiah to Israel. I hope everybody can acknowledge that he, Yahushua, Jesus, came to Israel as their Messiah. And if you go back into Israel and you begin to study Israel, in a nutshell, from the beginning, every single person that ever believed Yahweh, our Elohim, God. Everybody who believed, from Adam through Enoch, through Methuselah, through Noah, they all looked forward to and believed upon the Messiah. If you get into the writings of Enoch, which the patriarchs of Israel, the brothers, the 12 tribes, all knew things. They had writings they were studying that were different than the writings we were studying. If you get into what they penned in their last years of their lives, in their testaments, they knew things that they're lost to us today. Whatever they were reading are lost to us today. If it's not Enoch, and I really don't believe that Enoch, while I believe that Enoch is scripture, we've got all the problems of translations into our modern age that we have to factor in to our studying. But they probably had the writings of Enoch and probably other writings. Noah had writings at his disposal pre-flood. So all of these things existed out there, and all of them pointed to the Messiah. If you read Enoch, you will see the Messiah everywhere. So everybody believed in the promise. Once Adam fell, and everybody began to understand that they were going to never reach deliverance on their own, and they were going to need a savior, a promised leader to lead them out. And they believed in him before he came. And since Jesus is coming, or Yahushua is coming, now he's actually come the first time to earn and purchase the promises. You will see the promise, the redemption through his blood, the redemption of deliverance, the redemption of all of Israel, the redemption of the redeemed Israel, the redeemed promised land, the redeemed Jerusalem, everything. He purchased it all through his work on that first coming. And he's going to come to his second time to actually redeem it and bring it forth at that time. But we've had more than a couple thousand years of delay for that's happening. But my point is, we go back to the plan, and the plan involves Israel. First you have Abraham, then you have Isaac, then you have Jacob, then you have the formation of Israel that ultimately came then through the sons, the 12 tribes. But then with Moses, once they became numerous enough to become a nation, with Moses, we lead them out and we turn them into a nation, a country, in a place, in a promised land where they could begin, if they chose, to live with the priesthood in the ways of Yahweh, according to the ways that he prescribed for them. The Torah, his instructions. And they came into the land and formed as a nation. And this is the promise. This is the plan. They were the plan. The nation, Jacob, Israel, is the plan. These are the chosen and elect people. But then we watch them as they formed as a nation fail, because the majority of Israel never wanted him, never respected him, never chose his ways. They just simply went the ways of the Goyim around them, the nations around them, and rejected him. And ultimately that landed them in judgment. And the judgment was ultimately judgment within the land. They suffered in the land first, and then they were attacked. Israel, of the two nations that they had split into, Israel was attacked and taken away by Assyria, never to return to the land, not as a cohesive entity. So we have the 10 tribes of Israel gone and still dispersed. And then we had the two and a half tribes, or really I think it's 3 tribes. Doesn't really matter. The lands of Yehuda that stayed, but ultimately they were judged in the land. I'm just reading in Jeremiah all of the scarcity of food because of the drought in the times of Jeremiah related to, and this would also be the times of Josiah after the terrible king Manasseh served. My point is not to go into the weeds and the details of the failure, but just to reiterate that they failed. They failed because they rejected him. Then, and they were judged within the land, and then Assyria removed the northern kingdom, and Babylon came and removed the southern kingdom. But then the southern kingdom came back under the Persians and reformed in the lands of Judah, which is what for 400 and 500 years existed. And then we had the times when we would see the times of they call it the Second Temple period. And we have a few prophets from that period, and we have Ezra, we have Nehemiah, we have Zerubbabel as the leaders. And while they had come back into the land, they were not sovereigns of the land. They were just occupants of the land. They had some governorship and some leadership, but only under the larger purview of Persia, then Greece, because Greece then conquered Persia, and Judah was never a sovereign nation again. There was just a land within other kingdoms. And that was even true during the days of the Maccabees, when they arose, and then they had not some sovereignty, but they got their governorship back. They wrested back some controls, but they still existed within the lands of Greece during that time. Taken longer than I want to get these points out. My point is that during this Second Temple time that Yahushua, towards the end of it, was born into Israel, into the Torah, and it was a mess, because by the time he came along, the Pharisees had risen up. thanks to the work of the Maccabees. And it's not, you can't lay it entirely at the feet of the Maccabees, but then we had the Hasmonean. Through Greece, we had the kicking out of the legitimate priesthood. The sons of Zadok were kicked out. The last of them were kicked out during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And then we had illegitimate priesthood come in and usurp the priesthood and basically took over. So what we understand as Judaism, and we think of that as the religion of Israel, no, it's not. It's the religion of the Pharisees. The Pharisees rose to power. The Sadducees and other groups rose to power during the time of Greece and took over, introduced all of the oral traditions and different things that were chastised by John the Baptist and Yahushua, or Jesus, in his ministries. So you know that the doctrines of the Pharisees were wrong. They were not Torah. They had perverted Torah by the time, and that's Judaism. So we can't turn to Judaism to get our help in understanding Israel and the religion of Israel. We have to go back further. We have to go back to the times of Israel in the land, maybe at the beginning of the second temple period, but by the end of it, it was all over. My point is that in the old, we have to understand that Messiah came to Israel, and the promise and the plan is for Israel. Never has Israel been rejected. If you go back into the old writings, you can see the judgment. But in the midst of all the promised judgment that landed them in dispersion, which is the period that we're in, they were judged in the land, and then they were dispersed from the land as part of their judgment. They were kicked out of the land. First, the northern kingdoms were kicked out. Then the southern kingdoms were kicked out. By the time of 135 AD, they were completely removed from the land. All of Israel was dispersed, natural and spiritual. The church as well. The church departed and went out into the world. Israel departed and went out into the world. Well, the church continued to form and operate, but became Gentile-ish in nature and in doctrine. Israel continued out there, but became really identified with Judaism and as the rejectors of Messiah, which is not true. You can't say Israel rejected Messiah. The early church was Israel. The early church were all of the converts inside of Israel, the believers of Israel. So the church is Israel. What we've come to understand is Judaism are the Pharisees who rejected Messiah and continued to stay together and keep in their religious system, which is now identified primarily with rejectors of Messiah. But you got to understand that the promised dispersion is the state that we're in, and the promise is to Israel, remains to Israel, that there will come a time when he comes back, he is going to gather Israel from all the places that they've been scattered. Israel is the chosen and elect. The church is the chosen and elect as it relates to Israel. It is Israel that will be raptured and brought in. Raptured is a Greek word, but they will be resurrected. They will be gathered. The promises of Yahushua on the Olivet Discourse, in the Olivet Discourse, this is to Israel, not the church. Not the Gentile church, not what we have come to understand as the church today, as a body, as an institution. The church, yes, the church will be raptured, but not as they belong to this second covenant, this new covenant, this new religion, because the church is operating in a different religious system. It is not operating in the religious system of Israel. If the church really pays attention, and this is really what I'm after, they have an entirely different religious system. And it isn't from Elohim. It's not from God. It is from the imaginations it's from the enemy. And the enemy inserted all of these into the body of church to lead us all away. For the church to really get back to the ways of Yahweh, which is his name, our Elohim's name, for us to get back to his ways, we have to go all the way back and study his instructions to Israel. Now, clearly, I know it's confusing. The church has preconditioned everybody and prepared everybody to immediately, as soon as they hear that, say, what, do you want to go back to the law? Well, yes, but quit listening to the church's explanation of that. We cannot go back to the land. We're not in the land. We can't go back there and reestablish what was to be nationally in the ways of the laws. The priesthood is gone. The temple's gone. There's so much about the laws that we can't do. But we go back to the laws to discern what are his ways. And no, admittedly, the church, because you can't escape it. Paul and Yahushua teach, and the apostles teach the ways of moral behavior. You can do that, but there are other things that are taught in the old writings that you can't mistake, and that we should be incorporating. And we should learn from them what we should be avoiding. So in the church doctrines of today, there are things we should avoid and things we are avoiding we should be embracing. And I think we ought to be learning those if we really want to serve him. Is it an issue of salvation? For some, I think it probably is. For others, it's not. I really don't know. I'm not the one to answer that. What I can say emphatically is that the doctrines of the church are leading people astray. It is not leading people into the way, the things you celebrate, the way you celebrate, the day you celebrate as a church, because of church doctrines, are not the ways that we see being practiced in Israel. And I don't know how it's going to be. It's such an endeavor to try to figure out how the ways of Israel differ and to begin to employ them in our own lives here, cultures and centuries, millennia removed from it. We're best, we're going to be making mistakes. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We are still trying to learn. I think he's going to be teaching us. I think he is teaching us in the midst of it. And what he's really after, and I think we all know this, we instinctively know this in the church. We instinctively know it. And for those who are embracing, and let me also say here, well, let me finish that thought. For those who are embracing Torah, which is a whole group of people, I mean, it's growing. Torah embracers are growing because this understanding is coming to light, and it's a big movement within the church. But I'm finding that even, where I started it, when I began to understand the issue and I moved into Torah I just went into their teachings to learn. Well, as I've studied, I've learned that almost everybody, really everybody I've turned to, have doctrines that I have to ultimately reject. They have created understandings because they're moving outside of what's expressly taught and are moving into inferences and making speculations and doctrines and teaching things that I also reject. So I've got problems on all sides, and I don't claim to have all the answers, but I will say I can now tell when people have moved off into things that are not being expressly taught in scriptures. And I can protect myself more from it. And so we've created our own little gathering here so that we can share what is expressly taught and distinguish, and we might introduce things that we have speculated about, but we're trying very hard to recognize them as speculations and give them due treatment as speculation. So what I'm really trying to say is, if you are somebody who's considering what's happening in this world and you're wondering about the impact and the relationship of Torah, the instructions, to your life, and do you continue to hold on to the teachings of the church? Well, I would say if this is a question for you, and if this is something you are concerned with and addressing, then don't stay in the new. You cannot test your understanding of church doctrines against just the new writings. In fact, you must turn your attention to the old writings and the promises, because in summary, Israel has been judged in the land, then dispersed from the land as part of their judgment. But the promise is he will gather them back into a redeemed promised land that will include the redeemed Jerusalem, the redeemed, Mount Zion, the Kodesh, or the separate holy mountain, the Kodesh, or separate holy city. All of that's going to be redeemed and brought back to Israel. And when he brings back the people into the redeemed promised land, and I have lots of things I speculate about that, about what the promised land is maybe, and how the redeemed people get there. And those are speculations. The first, and the ideas of the second Exodus and how it's going to play out, the ideas of the rapture, and the idea of the New Jerusalem coming down. There are certain things that are expressed about that, but certain things that are having to be speculative. But I will say what is not speculative in the old writings is the promise that in the midst of the judgment, over and over again, Yahuwah says to his people, there's coming a day though, when you turn your heart, that I will turn to you and I will circumcise your heart. The command, just read it in Jeremiah, the command to us is to circumcise our own hearts. We are to be cutting away our sins and our flesh because they're synonymous. I mean, we're not literally cutting away flesh. We're cutting away the desires of the flesh that lead us to sin. We're called to do that while we live in the flesh. But there's coming a time in the resurrection, in my opinion, that he circumcises the sin from our heart, the flesh from our heart. And we are now made spiritual beings able to follow his instructions entirely without sin, without the impediment of flesh. These are promises coming in the promised land again that will be brought to the people. And the second time in the land, to finish that thought, they will be brought to his chosen people a second time. The first time it was brought to the nation of Israel, everything's been rejected and destroyed. The second time he brings his chosen and elect back, they will be made perfect and the land will be made perfect and better. And there are elements of, I think, natural men living in the land, and there are elements of spiritual men living in the land that I see taught that I have to speculate on, but I can expressly see that they are brought back into the land. The promise of Israel is that they will be brought back into a restored land. And this is the hope of the church. If you're part of the church, then this is the hope of the church. And if you are going to try to figure out what you're supposed to do, then you really need to be looking at what the old writings are telling you you should do. I will tell you, just in closing here, hopefully, in closing, just some of the most obvious, the things that everybody's arguing about, some of the most important things are, the instructions are the difference between clean and unclean foods, what you're to eat and not eat, which predates Moses. Noah knew it coming off the boat. All the animals were defined as clean and unclean animals. They knew what to eat and not eat then. And I know we have scriptures, especially in the translations, that say all these things are made available to you for food. But just like we see in the New Testament, that has to be weighed against and perceived against the larger command. You will not eat unclean food. That's an express command. And the references, when he says you can eat all this food, doesn't mean all the unclean food. He means what is already food, all of this stuff you can eat. I know that there are lots of things we could get into, and I don't really want to, but I will say that as the church, I think some of the doctrines you've been led, that we all were led into, that the church is being led into, is that you are in a new covenant that says the instructions are passé. It's for an Israel that has passed away. Well, I will say that if Israel has passed away and the promises to Israel have passed away, then what happens to all the promises that we see in the new writings that are coming to Israel? Israel is not done away with. It's still coming. And if the promises to Israel failed, then what makes us think we have reason to hope in a Messiah to Israel? Because he never came through on his promises to Israel. If it can happen, then we have no reason to hope. But we do have reason to hope because he's still working on those promises. In fact, the promises that he made would be that they would be dispersed and in judgment for a long period of time, only to be brought back. And all of that is taught in the old writings. That will all be happening when he comes that second time, when he comes and brings his kingdom here. And we have our good shepherd are sovereign. I mean, there's just so many words for the role Yahushua is playing now, but will be playing on earth when he comes back that second time. So if the promises to Israel failed, then we have no reason, the church has no business trying to, think, well, we have a Messiah that we can believe in, because if the Messiah failed his first grouping of people, why wouldn't he fail the second grouping of people? Well, he hasn't failed either one, because there is no second grouping of people, and he hasn't failed his first grouping of people. He's still bringing it about exactly as the old writings told us it would play out. We don't have all the details. In fact, every time I do test, people will come out with ideas of what they think is happening in these end times. And almost every time I test it, I just find it can't be. I am sure that there is nobody that's not going to be surprised as when it all plays out as to how it plays out. We will all be surprised as to who the 144,000 are, who the bride is. Now, I think it's clear that the New Jerusalem is considered the bride in Revelation. I know many people are referencing the church as the bride, Israel as the bride, but I don't see direct references to the church as the bride. I don't see direct references I understand why there are, I understand the confusion, but there is not like it calls the bride, the New Jerusalem, the bride. I mean, it clearly says, come, look, see the bride of the Lamb. That's New Jerusalem. That's expressly said. New Jerusalem is the bride of the Lamb. We do see references where the bride, there are references to wives and husbands in the land and different things. I do understand why there is a discussion, why there's confusion. And my real point is that at the end of, when it's all over, we will be surprised how it all played out, and what all of these things that we don't have full explanations for in Scripture, what they really meant and how they were intended to play out. What we're really called to over and over again is to love Yahweh, love our Elohim, love Yahushua, his son and his Messiah, in such a way that it impacts how we perceive and operate, that we lay down our own ideas in pursuit of what he's instructing us to be. And I know that's not simple at all. It's very hard. When the church just rejects everything of the old writing because they think that's law and they've been conditioned to do that, then they fail then to go and study what they ought to be trying to incorporate today in an effort to walk according to Yahweh. I think we need to be keeping Sabbath. There's no question how important, once you really spend your time in the old writings, if you are not keeping Sabbath, you are not going to be identified as Israel. That's one of the signs of the covenant between Yahweh and his chosen and elect people, Israel. Now, the question will be, and the church will say, yeah, but we are keeping Sabbath on Sunday. Well, even if you were keeping Sabbath, even if that was a legitimate thing to do, then you really need to be keeping Sabbath. The idea of Sabbath, if you're working and you're playing, and if you're doing other things on the Sabbath, you're not keeping Sabbath, even if you're trying to keep it on Sunday. I think that the logical time to be keeping Sabbath would be on the seventh day, which we see in our calendar systems to be Saturday, I think. There's another group that is keeping Tuesday, and I'm curious to see how they arrive at Tuesday. And maybe, depending upon what they share with me, would I try to determine what is the best way to keep Sabbath? Maybe, probably, no, certainly. But whether or not I'm going to need a real preponderance of evidence to move it from the seventh day that I understand to be the Saturday in our system to a seventh day that is considered Tuesday in our system. So I'm going to need real evidence, but I'm open to that. And but that we are to be keeping a Sabbath, and that the safe thing to do is to be keeping it right now on the seventh day. You're reckoning of a seventh day and not the first day, because the church clearly knows it's the first day, but it's not meant to be. It's the seventh day. I'm just saying that, there are some things that we ought to, as the church, be bringing back, and that is the idea of the Sabbath, what we eat, And I think also the feast days, I think we need to quit celebrating the days that were commingled with other deities and that the church has embraced. Easter, Valentine's Day, and Christmas as a basic minimum of things that we ought to be lopping off and getting rid of because of their proximity to other Elohim, other mighty ones, violating the command that we are to have no other Elohim, no other gods before him, violating that when we take up Easter and Christmas. Well, even if I'm wrong about this, the safe thing to do is not keep it and replace it with what is safe, what he did give to Israel as the appointed times, the feast days, and begin incorporating them. I think the church ought to be doing that. It's hard, as I study more and more, I'm realizing we are to keep the days. But when we bring the offering of fire, I've been trying to figure that out, offering made by fire, in the commands of Leviticus 23, I think we are once again going back to the temple era and bringing the offering made by fire that the priests made at the temple at the time that we cannot individually do. So we can't go to the land. We can't do that offering made by fire if it truly is to be done in the temple. But we can acknowledge the day and keep the Sabbath as we were commanded to do. Just think of the day, like on Yom Kippurim, HaKippurim, which is the Day of Atonement. We are to afflict our souls. Well, what is I embrace the idea that afflicting our soul is to be a day of contemplation of what our sin has cost our Elohim, what our sin has cost our Messiah, Yahushua. It cost him to come and suffer the way he did and to die and to blaze our path. But he went through so much to accomplish this, and we ought to be contemplating our sin and the cost of our sin, and that is afflicting our soul. That should be a day of contemplation. Okay, the video's gone longer than I intended. It always does, and I'm sorry. Thank you, and may you be Baruch.